Good morning, everybody. Welcome. My name is Jaime Guiaga. I'm the host of the Carlos Bulosan Club podcast. This will be our second episode. Carlos Bulosan Book Club is sponsored by the Friends of the Echo Park Library, right in the heart of historic Filipino town. Today, we have Cindy Domingo, our guest speaker for the podcast. Cindy Domingo is the daughter of longtime Filipino community members Adelina Domingo and the late Nemencio Domingo Sr. It was their influence and activism in the Filipino community that contributed to her own activism as well as her brothers and sisters. Cindy Domingo has dedicated over 4 decades of her life as a political activist working for social change locally, nationally, and internationally. In addition, Cindy has spent 24 years as a public servant in her capacity as Chief of Staff to King County Council member Larry Gossett. Cindy has served on the board of directors of several prominent national women's organizations, including the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, as well as local organizations such as the Church Council of Greater Seattle, LILO, a legacy of equality, leadership, and organizing, APALA, and the International Examiner newspaper. As a writer and independent scholar, Cindy co-edited A Time to Rise, memoirs of the Katipunan ng mga Demokratikong Pilipino, KDP, or Union of Democratic Filipinos, recently published by the University of Washington Press. Cindy co-authored a story in the book by Mila de Guzman, Women Against Marcos, and traveled to the Philippines in February 2016 to launch the book. She has also written articles for Filipinas Magazine, Journal of Asian American Studies, and local newspapers, and serves as the Northwest correspondent for Inquirer.net. We are honored and excited to have Cindy Domingo today for our second episode, and I'd like to introduce her.
Thank you, Jaime, and thank you for the invitation to come here today. I'm glad that I was able to combine this visit in the launching of A Time to Rise and to be here with you all at the Carlos Bulosan Book Club. And it's given me an opportunity to review some of the work that I've done around Carlos Bulosan over the past couple of decades. And as many of you, Carlos Bulosan's book, America's in the Heart, was a great inspiration to me. It, as a Filipino American born in the United States, it gave me the inspiration that generation, those whose shoulders we stand on today, gave me an understanding of my own father's immigrant experience, who also came to this country in the 1920s and experienced some of the hardships that Bulosan writes about in America's in the Heart. And so when I read that book when I was in college, combined with my first trip to the Philippines in 1974, it really instilled in me a love for the Philippines and a love as a Filipino, and helped me identify as a Filipino American, that Filipino part of being Filipino American. And that's always stayed with me. And over the years, I've done work in different projects concerning Carlos Bulosan and trying to institutionalize his work, his legacy, and educating others about his contributions as a writer and as a poet. And as we were talking about before, a love of our own Filipino arts and culture. And so many of some of the projects that I've done around in Carlos Bulosan's name has been to popularize our art and culture of the Filipino people. And America's in the Heart is the University of Washington's is the biggest seller of the university press. And when it was first published, they didn't expect that. But it is, I think, it's been republished over 15 times, and it is the most popular book that is studied in Filipino American history as well as Asian American history classes, as well as social movement classes in the universities and colleges. And that should make us very proud as Filipinos and Filipino Americans. But yet there are many Filipinos who still do not know about Carlos Bulosan. And so I think this book club, as well as other projects that have started and may not have continued, have led to his continuing to try to popularize and educate Filipinos in this country, as well as in the Philippines. And I'm going to talk about one of the large initiatives that is being launched in Bulosan, in Carlos Bulosan's hometown, that I hope that one day, I was telling Jocelyn that maybe one day when that Carlos Bulosan Center is opened, that we can do a educational trip and present, some of the work that you've done here in the Carlos Bulosan Book Club, as well as other people have done around the United States, to make that link between Filipinos in the Philippines as well as here in the United States. I think it would be a very transnational project that the mayor of Bulosan has launched, and a willingness to reach out to U.S. Filipino communities using Carlos Bulosan as that link. So what I wanted to do today is just talk a little bit about Carlos Bulosan and then some of the work and the projects that I've been involved in, and then open it up for discussion. So, Carlos Bulosan was really, his political development, his works, his writings were all a result of the political period in which he came to the United States in, as well as the period in which he lived. As you know, he was not very old when he died in the 1950s, and he had many periods of when he did not write, but that when he came to this country in 1930, he did not mean to become a writer. And in the research, people are not quite sure what led him to write. But it was obviously the political atmosphere, the political conditions in which he was arriving in the United States that led to his writing, as well as his deep connection to the Philippines. Even though he never returned home, like many of the old men, the manongs, that came during that period of time, he never returned home. But yet he continued to have deep connections with the Philippines through his relationship with his family. And so many people think that one of the reasons he took up writing was to communicate with his family in the Philippines, but also because of the conditions in which he and his other fellow manongs faced in the period in which he lived in the United States. So he came to the United States about 1930, and that was at the height of the Depression. Many people, millions of people were out of work. It was the height of the anti-Filipino raids and discrimination against Filipinos. That was the period of time of the anti-Filipino riots during the Watsonville riots. And so Carlos Bulosan, we believe, began to write out of rebellion out of frustration over the conditions that Filipinos faced in this country, as well as what he saw during the Depression, where many people were hungry and unemployed. And so that's when you begin to see his political awareness develop in terms of the conditions that he lived in and others, as well as his, during that period of time, the Communist Party and socialists were organizing during the Depression. And there was union organizing going on amongst Filipinos and agricultural workers and cannery workers. And Carlos Bulosan was able to connect with those union organizers, with people in the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, and that developed his political consciousness. And so then, and two of the people that he connected with that had a great influence on him were the Babb sisters, Sonara Babb and her sister Dorothy. And that was the period of time, and so he immigrated in about 1930 through Seattle. And then, as Jaime was saying earlier, he contracted tuberculosis in 1936 and spent 2 years in the hospital recuperating. And it really was as a result of going to the library and getting books from the library that he was able to educate himself. And then meeting with the two sisters who were socialists, self-identified socialists, and then connecting, earlier days with labor organizers who obviously were connected with the Communist Party of the United States. And so during those 2 years, Bulosan read many, many books in the LA public library system, and as I said, educated himself and became politicized and began to write about that period of time. At that same time, during the 1930s, were all of these Filipino labor strikes. And even though he was sickly, he was able to continue to have connections with the labor organizers and keep abreast of the labor strikes when he was unable to participate. At the same time, there was a committee called the American Committee for the Protection of the Foreign-Born, in which he contributed writings to and went when he was able to participate. Probably one of his most famous writings, which many people have never read, don't know really about the history, was one that President Roosevelt commissioned him to write, and that was The Freedom from Want. And if you read that, it was one of 4 freedoms, which was a vision for what President Roosevelt wanted for people and what true democracy would look like. And Carlos Bulosan wrote that. It was published. I know that in Washington State, they have an original copy of Freedom from Want. And it is a vision about what people should have, that they should not be wanting for food, they should not be wanting for freedom, but that it should be all of theirs. And that's what a true democracy looks like. And so the 4 freedoms that are written, and one which was President Roosevelt requested him to write, which was published in the magazine, the Washington Post, reflects that kind of vision that Carlos Bulosan had developed over his years as intersecting with the various political movements that he was able to intersect with. There was a period of time in which Carlos Bulosan became disenchanted, and that was, and did not do much writing, and that was the period in which after his release from the hospital. And it was really, in some ways it was really his comrades that he had met in the labor movement and in the Communist Party that really, quote unquote, saved him, that resurrected in him that vision, that role of the writer, the value of his skills, and that was his dear friend, Chris Salvis Sr., who and Chris, who spent much of his time in the Northwest as the president of the Local 37, the Alaska Cannery Workers, which at that point was associated with the International Longshore and Warehousemen's Union, was president from 1949 to 1959. And it was in 1946 that Chris Salvis Sr. convinced Carlos Bulosan to come to Seattle and to use his writing skills for the purposes of advancing the role of workers in Filipino workers in particular. And he commissioned him to come and write for the Local 37. And his most famous writing was the 1952 yearbook of the Local 37. And in that yearbook, you will see the intersection between what is happening in the Philippines and what is happening in the United States with workers in this country. And so Carlos Bulosan really had the vision of a transnational community, back in the 1950s. And that's why that yearbook is so important. And in that yearbook, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to bring a copy with me, but in that yearbook, he covers the developments in the Philippines. He talks about the Hook Rebellion, interviews Luis Turok, who was head of the Hook Rebellion at the time, as well as talks about the advances of Filipino workers and other workers through the unionization of the history of the unionization in the United States of agricultural workers and cannery workers. He talks about, in particular, because this is a yearbook of the Alaska cannery workers, the advances in wages, the advances of working conditions that occurred from the 1920s through the 1950s until there was heavy attacks on that union during the 1950s, during the McCarthy era. But he talks, so that yearbook is important because it talks about the importance of unionization and what advances the union had been able to make of unionizing agricultural workers and cannery workers. It's an important piece it's an important historical piece in terms of Filipino workers and the influence that the radical movements have in the Philippines on the movement here in the United States. And that's important because none of those men ever went home, but yet they continued year after year, decade after decade, to identify with that radical movement, the progressive movements in the Philippines. They always saw that international solidarity was important to that union. And that those were the lessons that Jaime and my and Vicky's generation took up. We went to those members of the Local 37, those members of the the radicals that were radicalized back in the 40s and 50s. We went to them and received inspiration from their work. That's why I say we stand on their shoulders, because they shared with us our experiences, their experiences. And, for example, when my brother and other young Filipino and Asian Americans went back into the Alaska Cannery Workers, they went to Chris Salvis. They read the yearbook, 1952 yearbook, and said, these are the kinds of values and principles that we want to reinstill in our union, a union that had fallen after the 1950s when the radical leadership was ousted from that membership and a more corrupt leadership took over. We want to instill in our union the values and principles that are reflected in the 1952 yearbook that were led by Chris Salvis and Carlos Bulosan. And for example, when that reform movement in the Union created its first newsletter, they named it after the newsletter that Carlos Bulosan used to write for, and that was called The New Tide. And that became the newsletter of the new generation because they saw that that was the movement that they wanted to reflect, led by Carlos Bulosan and Chris Monsalves Sr. I think it was also fortunate that Carlos Bulosan came to Seattle because then he met Josephine Patrick, who also was a member of the Communist Party of the United States, but in his last years took care of Carlos Bulosan and became his partner in terms of organizing, and she continued to bring him around the other artists and cultural workers in Seattle so that he continued to have that kind of influence on other artists and cultural workers, intersection with them, as well as labor organizers and community organizers. And unfortunately, he died, as you know, in 1956 on that infamous day, September 11th. Interesting how many things happen on September 11th, right? It is, when Carlos died, he was a poor man, and unfortunately died in obscurity, and only in some circles was well known, and more the radical circles. And it was not until the University of Washington published his book that then attention began to come upon him. What a creative writer, how if you go back, like Jaime, I went back and reread the book and was, and probably because of our own political development, realized how much of it is still so relevant today in terms of what you see in the United States and what you see in terms of the conditions that poor people and other people of color face, especially immigrants in this country. And, there have been, because Seattle at the University of Washington, I think holds one of the largest collections of Carlos Bulosan's archives at the Labor Archives, and that's because Josephine Patrick donated the majority of the papers that she held for Carlos Bulosan after he died. She donated it to the University of Washington. And Carlos Bulosan's grave is in Seattle, Washington, and as a result of growing popularity around his works, and as a symbol of the Filipino experience in the United States, has become a place where Filipino Americans come as part of their identity in terms of finding their history. It's a very well-known marker in terms of visitors who come to Seattle. As a result of that, he has a very nice, in the 1980s, money was collected, probably late 1970s, money was collected by various people to give him a beautiful headstone with that Josephine was still alive, and otherwise his grave would go unmarked. But now people can find his grave very easily, and the caretakers of that cemetery say it's always visited. As I said, the University of Washington Archives also is a place where many people come to do research around Bulosan. They have many of his original papers, and in I think it was 2014, we did a major centennial around Carlos Bulosan. Now, it's interesting that no one has been able to mark the exact date, a year of his birth. They have the date, but not the year, and that's because during the war that many records were destroyed, so it's 1911, 1913, or 1914. But we decided to mark the centennial of his birth using the year 2014. So the University of Washington, Harry Bridges Labor Center decided to hold the centennial with community partners and held an all-day symposium around Carlos Bulosan, inviting scholars and community members to come, and then a host of events that were held in the community in relationship to his birth date. There have been other important events that have been held. In 2008. The Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., through the Asian Division Friends Society and through an organization called Our Own Voice that was run by Remy Grafalda, held a all-day Carlos Bulosan at the symposium at the Library of Congress. And again, inviting many well-known Bulosan scholars to present, as well as, so that was April of 2006, and that was coupled with the opening or the beginning of the Carlos Bulosan archives. And they wanted to make the Library of Congress in the Asian Division also to have a permanent repository of Carlos Bulosan papers, hoping that researchers and scholars would come to the Library of Congress to find those papers. I don't know what the state of those archives are, but it seems that there are, combined with the University of Washington, what might also be at the Library of Congress. Those are two places in which people might find the papers and archives of Carlos Bulosan. The third place is a new initiative that was just developed over the last 2 years, and that is in Bulosan, Philippines, and that's the birthplace of Carlos Bulosan and his family. The mayor of that town, Mayor Ramon Gayco, has initiated a project in which Bulosan would also become the center of Carlos Bulosan researchers and scholars. And he is developing, along with his city council, a museum dedicated to Carlos Bulosan. And they have come to Seattle, Washington to do research, to collect archives, to embellish also the archives that they have in Bulosan. They have many original papers of Bulosan that he had sent to his own family from way back when, as well as letters that he wrote to his family. And I was able, when I went there in January, saw many of those letters, which give you an insight to how he was seeing life in the United States. And these are many papers and letters that many people don't know exist. I mean, I certainly didn't know they existed until I saw them myself, and I only saw just a few of the letters and papers that they showed me. So they are building a museum dedicated to Carlos Bulosan, in which they will have these archives. And interestingly enough, the museum will be housed in a school that was built by the U.S. Armed Forces back in the 1930s and 40s. And they're hoping to have that museum finished, I think, by the end of 2019. And I was telling Jocelyn it would be great to bring this book club and other people to visit that town and to tell them about the work that you're doing as part of the Carlos Bulosan Book Club, and to do presentations about some of the work that we've done here in the United States. They're expecting to have, conferences about Carlos Bulosan, and to not just focus on Carlos Bulosan, but the transnational character of the Filipino community, and the experience, and to share the experiences of U.S. Filipino communities here, and especially focusing on art and culture. Binalonan is not a very large town, but they're hoping that establishing this center, establishing it as a arts and culture center with the name of Carlos Bulosan will help as well in terms of the economic development of that town, because the mayor knows that depending only on agricultural fields is not going to bring the economic boom that town needs. Binalonan has also produced a musical play based off of Carlos Bulosan's work, and they're hoping that as people come to Binalonan, that they can produce this more often for people that are coming to Binalonan. So it's an ongoing piece of work, and maybe one day the mayor would want to come to Los Angeles and be interviewed about his work, or some of the researchers that he's sending to the United States, and they usually come in the fall in conjunction with a conference in Washington, D.C. The last thing I wanted to talk about was in 1999, I, and along with other Filipino community members and other Asian Americans, created the Carlos Bulosan Historical Exhibit in the historical part of Seattle in the International District, our Chinatown. And it was a 3-year project, and actually, like most Chinatowns, International District was the historical home of the Filipino Manongs. And they used to come by the hundreds because that was the home of the Alaska Cannery Workers Union. And so as part of the migration along the West Coast, before the agricultural work, they would come up to Seattle to be dispatched by by Local 37, and would line the streets by the hundreds to go to the canneries. And my father was one of those cannery workers. And they stayed in the hotels in the International District. Today, there's only, I think, one unionized cannery left in Alaska that Local 37 dispatches to. Local 37, for many reasons, is a dying local. But we wanted to pay tribute not only to Carlos Bulosan, but to the Manongs that used to come to Seattle and used to live in the International District. Today, there are no Filipino stores, nothing except a couple of markers of Filipinos in the International District. They were part of, at one point, they were probably the largest population that lived in the International District, certainly during the periods of time in which they would go to Alaska and come back home. They contributed to the economic as well as the social vitality of that International District. But today, there are no vestiges in terms of stores or even fraternal lodges. The fraternal lodges also used to be located in the International District. So in 1996, it actually was a Japanese-American man, Andy Mizuki, who used to be in the KDP in the Seattle chapter, who said we should create an exhibit, some kind of exhibit that would pay honor to the Filipino Manongs that had lived and participated and had contributed to the history of the International District. And there was a hotel that the Manongs used to stay in that was being renovated. It's called the Eastern Hotel, and it was his idea to create an exhibit that would tell the history of Filipinos in Seattle in the International District, as well as their contributions to the Alaska cannery workers. So we created the Carlos Bulosan Historical Exhibit in the Eastern Hotel, and it took us 3 years. It was, as we continued to organize around it, we had many, many ideas, but finally we said, okay, this is 3 years and we gotta open it. And it actually is it's a very small exhibit, but it's really the only place that you can learn about Filipino presence that used to be in the International District, as well as the Manong's contribution to the cannery workers and other professions in what they did as work in the West Coast. It is the centerpiece of the exhibit is a large mural that was done by Eliseo Art Silva. And it is an exhibit, it's a mural, a large mural, that depicts both the life of Carlos Bulosan, but the life of many of the Manongs that immigrated in the 1920s and 30s. And in the centerpiece is a large salmon running through the mural, and Eliseo used the salmon because the salmon, if you know anything about the life of a salmon, the salmon returns to its birthplace in order to die. And so because these men, even though they never returned to the Philippines, in their hearts and minds, Philippines was always part of them. And so, there are many, if you ever come to Seattle, I hope you'll come to visit the exhibit. There are pictures of the Filipino men in the fields organizing with members of the Communist Party of the United States. There are photos of the men in the canneries, the work that they did, as well as a large picture on the opposite wall of the mural of a commemoration of Filipino men who had worked in the canneries for over 25 or over years. And my father is in that mural, but it was a way to honor these men. And many of these men don't understand why they were being honored, because they lived in the International District. They were very humble. They only worked in the canneries or in the fields. But we, as I said, stand on their shoulders. They worked very hard, and most of them ended up with no families and ended up living in the International District in single rooms. So we hope that exhibit continues as a memorial to their contributions, and I hope you will visit it if you come. It's probably of many of all the projects that I've done, when I pass it at night in the International District, it still brings me great joy to look at it, and I feel very proud of that exhibit. I have brought with me, because Jocelyn asked, for a bibliography of Carlos Bulosan. We'll have to make a copy of many of his writings, as well as a list. This was produced as part of the Library of Congress's symposium, list of his works, and many of them are not available. That's one thing we can do is, there are only a couple of 2 or 3 books, a couple that are that Sunny San Juan had done, republishing Carlos Bulosan's poems and some of his one of his novels, as well as America's in the Heart. But if you go to the University of Washington archives, he has many, many writings that should be published as a way to popularize Bulosan. So, okay.
Thank you, Cindy. I've learned so much about Carlos Bulosan in your presentation, because my exposure has been only his work, America's in the Heart. And we know there's much that he's done, and you've contributed to that, not only for my own knowledge, but hopefully through this podcast, which we will try to distribute widely, that a lot of people will learn more about Carlos Bulosan. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jaime.
So I'd like to open it up for questions from the group. Anybody?
Yeah, I want to share that, this time that I heard the first time about Carlos Bulosan, yeah, it's a fascinating story, and I think not all the Filipino were being understand about the story of Carlos Bulosan. Yes, a very good story.
Yeah.
It's education.
I remember there was an attempt to make a movie out of Carlos Bulosan, but it never pushed through. Are you familiar with that? I'm not sure.
You know, I know a number of years we were approached that someone was making a film. And recently there is a filmmaker from the Philippines who also is interested. I met him, I can't remember his name, but I met him during the San Francisco Filipino Book Festival. And he wants to make a full feature film about Carlos Bulosan. But again, you know, there are many people who want to do projects around Carlos Bulosan, but have been unable to complete them. But I hope this filmmaker in the Philippines, and he was supposed to come to Seattle to begin his research. I hope that he will push through.
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
I was curious. I know you referred to the older generation as manongs, and I heard that manong means like older brother. And so where does that come from? If they're like an older generation, how can you call it, like, wouldn't they be more like uncles or, I don't know. I was just curious about the word manong.
Well, I guess in my history, like even when I went to school, it was an all-girls school, and all of the help there were called manang. So it's like in different hierarchies of society, I think that was sort of a generic term that applied for like a word of respect. So uncle, I know in other cultures, uncle is more prevalent, like in the Vietnamese culture. Uncle used in a more generic way to honor and you know, to refer to someone older. But it seems like in the Philippines, manong and manang were words, sort of generic words to honor and you know, acknowledge the elder status, and that's also part of the value of our cultural value of respecting older people, regardless of what rank or status they had. I don't know, that's my...
I have one more question. Since you're familiar with the Seattle area, I've been doing some research on Larry Itliong, and I was wondering, was there ever a point or someone that did research on the intersection of Larry Itliong and Carlos Bulosan? Or at least there
Or
was.
Philip Veracruz.
Or Philip Veracruz, for that matter.
And
You know,
there's
you
some
know
others.
that all of those men knew each other and must have worked together, but I have never seen research which really
Links them.
intersected
Connected.
them. And oftentimes, you know that the intersection must have come through the organizers of the Communist Party of the United States. And so people often tell me that you're going to have to go to the archives in New York City, which some of the archives of the CPUSA are housed in the archives in the public library, the main public library in New York City, as well as going to Russia and finding someone who speaks and can read Russian to go into those archives to look at the real connections in terms of the organizing that the CPUSA must have done amongst Filipinos. It's very difficult, and I think it's because of the McCarthy era, and to find those documents, to find the relationships, as well as the strategies that the CPUSA used to organize Filipinos. The Filipinos were probably in a secret cell because they were not citizens. They were in a secret cell of the CPUSA if they were in the CPUSA. So even, it's very difficult for people who went through the McCarthy era. One of the lawyers that we worked very closely in my brother's case, John Coughlin, served as one of the lawyers in the defense of some of the Filipino immigrants that were under deportation in the 1950s. And he himself said that he didn't know whether or not those Filipinos were in the Communist Party. And he himself, when I interviewed him in the 1980s, said on camera when I interviewed him that was the first time he admitted that he was in the Communist Party. So he'd been in the party, I'm sure, over 50 years because he was in his 80s by the time he died. And I think he was about 80 years old when I interviewed him on camera. So it's very hard because of the McCarthy era.
As far as Larry Itliong, I know Mark Pulido told me that because he had met and gone to actually met and talked to Larry Itliong before he died. He mentioned that Larry Itliong was a delegate to the 1968 Chicago Convention for McGovern. So Larry Itliong was part of the Democratic Party. And, I was quite surprised and delighted to hear that. He was an actual delegate to the National Convention. So he may have been more in that kind of organizing realm rather than, because the Communist Party and the McCarthy era really clamped down on that branch of organizing. So anyway, just to answer your question about whether there was an intersection, I don't think, I've never heard of it.
Are the McCarthy era papers available as Public Request Act?
They must be, obviously. Now, I was telling Jaime that Lane Hirabayashi and his wife obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, obtained Carlos Bulosan's papers. I don't know,
Because here he's being, he's a communist, but
Right.
Roosevelt respected him enough
Right.
to include him in something that Norman Rockwell was working on
Right.
too.
Right. But he could have, that's the thing, could have been in the party, but the people like the Babb sisters, they were in the party. Josephine Patrick was in the party. So he was in those circles, especially the circles of artists and cultural workers who were closely related or in the party. He was greatly influenced. Whether or not he was in the party, he was greatly influenced by the party and the radical politics.
I think there's a question.
Oh, one more question, go ahead.
Well, just to kind of piggyback on that, I'm just curious as to your opinion as to why, and whether politics plays into this question, why the popularity of his work is not more widespread and seems kind of marginalized in this country, and with the current political atmosphere as well, whether censorship might be involved in it. In the past, is there something we don't know that might have influenced his exposure in this country?
Well, part of it is, I think, just if you go to bookstores now, or you go to the library, there's very little written about the Filipino-American experience. Most of it is about the Manong experience. And it's only now that you can see, more novels written by Filipino and Filipino-American authors. Unlike in the Philippines, where there's a lot of literature, a lot of development of novels and documentaries, etc. Here in the United States, there's very little. I mean, you go to the bookstore, you'll see bookcases full of Vietnamese American authors, same with Chinese American and Japanese American, and then you go to the Filipinos and there are like 3-4 books. I remember I was so excited when I went to the University of Washington and saw a bookstore and saw our book. But there were only, I think, 3 other books alongside it. And it just is very dismal in terms of the popularity of Filipino American writers and
The
authors.
exposure.
Yeah, and exposure.
Does it have to do with his political?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I mean, it could be that his writing, because we can't even get things republished that have been published before. You would think that the University of Washington would want to publish some more of his works, but we can't get them to do it.
Do the reasons for that is?
I don't know. I mean, they just, relative to what's out there to being published, they don't want to publish.
Isn't it owned by the his estate?
Well, the
Officially
rights,
his
the
writing,
rights, the
yes.
rights are, but it doesn't really have anything to, that's not why they're not publishing his stuff. I mean, obviously they get royalties from his Americas in the Heart, but how much more if they published other works and it can be used in the classrooms, in writing classes,
Yeah,
etc.
but then you'd be teaching kids how to be communists and
Well,
socialists. And
you
in
know,
this
right.
atmosphere,
Well, but there are other books in other cultures that do that, So I don't think that that's necessarily so in terms of, I think it has to do with the status of the Filipino community here. I mean, we're a community that's been here for over 100 years, and yet our position in society has not risen to the top like other communities of color. And that, I think, has a lot to do with U.S.-Philippine relations, the colonization process, as well as it will, not only depend on us, but the new generation to demand that this is our history and we want to know about our history. So.
I have a little question. Christmas Salvas is actually what I was going to ask a lot about. Do you know any more about what happened to him?
Christmas Salvas, ended up living in the International District after he was ousted from the Union. He also lived in obscurity. He had a family. He has 3 children that are still alive, a daughter and 2 sons. Both of his sons live in Mexico. They have very mixed feelings, like a lot of children of activists, about their parents' activism, and but proud of who their father was. But at the same time, they knew Carlos Bulosan as well. They were little, but at the same time feeling like, they also felt the brunt of the McCarthy era and the anti-communism that their father faced. They faced as a family. And so they actually, in the building of the Carlos Bulosan historical exhibit, they contributed photos to that. His daughter had a beautiful photo of the founding of the Agricultural and Cannery Workers Union. It was, it's a photo that I had never seen before. And it was one of the multiracial nature of that union, in which there were white women, black workers, Filipinos, and Asians who were all part of this huge union that organized agricultural workers and cannery workers. It's one of a kind photo.
I think one of Carlos Bulosan's, I love his poetry. The song for Christmas on his
Oh,
birthday
it's beautiful.
is
Right.
yeah.
I mean,
That's why.
and that poem was I think it was like written, he just sat down and wrote that poem, which shows you what a beautiful writer he was. I mean, if he had become an educated writer, and gone on to college, you could see the glimpse of what he could have became, but because of discrimination, he was never, circumstances, he never was able, that's why they say he didn't come to this country to become educated, and but yet he was such a beautiful writer.
So the tuberculosis was a curse and a blessing.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
I heard that he held court in the public library and
Right.
hung out at Pershing Square a lot.
Well, if you see in the mural, Eliseo has a scene where he's laying in his bed and reading. And that's where Eliseo got that from, because that's what that is supposed to be. And Josephine sitting
But if we
next to
could
him.
find out which nook
Which ward?
or corner in the library.
It's been
and then
changed
but then have it
after
dedicated.
the fire. The fire burnt down that nook. In the 80s, 87, the library, Central Library burned. It had a major fire. So that's why, now it's a beautiful building because they had, by force of circumstance.
We should have a little plaque there.
Yeah.
Dedicated to Carlos
Actually,
Bulosan.
that's a good idea. Yeah.
They, in one of the papers that came from the symposium, they have a library card. A library book card where it was stamped that he had. I think it has there, yeah.
So can we have a copy of this? Could
Yes,
you email
yes,
this?
yeah.
So we
Actually,
can distribute
I'm
it?
going to, I could, and then I wanted to, I'll email, I'll send you this packet of, of the papers that were presented at the symposium. I'll send that to
wonderful.
you, yeah.
Because
I didn't
maybe
have
we
a
could
chance to.
start a section at the Philippine Heritage in one of the stacks of Carlos Bulosan, collection. We could start building
Yeah,
some of the resources.
And share it with people who are trying to do research.
Right.
We have a list of references that they can
Right.
Yeah.
give them leads.
and I can make you a copy of the 1952 yearbook.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, it's wonderful to read that yearbook.
Oh, that would be great.
That's
Not
unprintable,
published.
not publishable.
Oh, that's a good idea. They should republish that, yeah.
That might be your project.
But again, I want to thank Cindy. It was a
Yeah.
great presentation. This is the first edition of the book America's in the Heart, which was published in 1973 by the University of Washington. Introduction by Carrie McWilliams. So I think this is very rare to find. And the second edition, which is this book here, which is available on Amazon, was published, came out in 2014. And so, anyway, this ends the second episode.
Announcement.
We have episodes that are already planned and speakers who have confirmed. So we meet every other month, the third Saturday of the month. The speakers will be Estella Habal and Terry Mast. So
Come to our website. We will post more information at our
the website is friendsofechoparklibrary.org, and we will have links there to the Carlos Bulosan Book Club,
No, it's friendsechopark.org.
friendsechopark.org. Okay. Anyway, this concludes our podcast. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to having you again in the future.